Plumas County Public Health Agency, growing healthy communities.
Great, okay. So I work as the injection drug use specialist with the State Office of AIDS, and one of our primary missions is to expand access to sterile syringes through syringe exchange, through pharmacy sale. And as you can well imagine, as we're doing this work, some people have questions. And sometimes those questions are really mellow and born out of real curiosity. Like, I have never heard of this thing before. You mean you give somebody a new needle and then they go and inject drugs with that needle? And the answer is yes, that is exactly what we do. It's a really important part of the service that we bring. And we do a whole host of other things as well. So it's just yes, question, and answer. But sometimes it's not so mellow. Sometimes it is pretty aggravated, pretty frightened, pretty aggressive. And I have found that those objections are sometimes the most challenging, is when people come with a lot of heat. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is what are the primary objections that you hear? What are some of the reasons behind those objections? What's going on, especially if there's a lot of feeling behind it? What's happening for that person? And then the third thing is that how can we respond in a way that is supportive to the person, true to ourselves and what we actually believe, and for the person on the receiving end, that they are experiencing this as informative, not condescending, not hostile, all of the things that we feel the urge to do sometimes when we're caught off guard. So we already know, we've already gone over definitions of harm reduction, and my experience has been that I often define harm reduction differently depending on what we're talking about and who we're talking to. When I talk to people about syringe exchange, I often say, we work with people while they continue to use drugs. And that often is an aha moment for people, like, oh, okay. So if they're asking me, why aren't you getting people in treatment? I say, oh yeah, well, my work is with people who are continuing to use drugs. And that is sometimes helpful, and it's also sometimes helpful talking about abstinence not being the only goal of harm reduction services, because abstinence has a high failure rate. It's a great way to reduce harm, but like abstinence as a birth control method, has a high failure rate. So you want to bring in these other tools and these other tricks and other resources for people. So when we look at all the different yes, there we go. When we look at all these different interventions, it's not the same objection every single time, right? Sometimes it's, you're a threat to my children. Sometimes it's, you're a threat to my recovery. So it's different. So what I want to ask you to do now is just make your little group and talk about what are some of the main objections that you hear in the work that you do, and maybe identify some of the ones that you find the most difficult to respond to. So just take a few minutes to do that. Okay, so hold those in the back of your mind for right now, because we want to talk a little bit about where some of these objections come from, because they have a bunch of different sources depending on who's saying it, and also depending on how angry they are. But harm reduction really presents some very key challenges, especially for people who work in medical, social service, and drug treatment fields, because we're in the helping professions. And if we learn that perhaps we haven't been as helpful as we thought we were, it can be very alarming. So I would say first, harm reduction presents a challenge to our knowledge. We have learned about drug use since 4th grade, Miss Thorman's class. And we've gotten a lot of information, and we've learned that some of that information was incorrect. We did perhaps draw the conclusion that maybe marijuana isn't always a gateway drug. We may have known people who have had full recoveries, and so realize perhaps that recovery isn't the only alternative to death or insanity. There may be other things that we've heard, both through our regular education system, through the media, that have given us a time to say, you know what, not all that information is correct. But we haven't then used that opportunity to learn all that there is. And one of the things that harm reduction does is it brings a new set of facts to light. And that can be really surprising for people. And it will often bring people to the place where they think, you know what, everything I've been taught is wrong. And for some people, that's an exhilarating thought. I bet for a lot of people here in the room, they think, wow, everything I've taught was wrong. But most people don't have that reaction. Most people feel really alarmed by it. And so that's one way that harm reduction presents a real challenge. Another area of challenge is challenge to people's experience. So if you're working with a drug treatment counselor, for example, who believes that there's no way to have any kind of managed drug use, they feel that when they were using drugs, that they were completely out of control. And they have clients who will come in and say, I am completely out of control. Then if you're trying to present an idea that's really common in harm reduction, that people can manage or have some controlled drug use, you'll get a lot of pushback from that. Because people will say, you're telling me that I can't trust my own experience. And that is not the message that we want to give. If you think about, for any of you that have ever done counseling, when you do harm reduction counseling, you're really helping people look at their experience in a different way. So I have a friend who was working with somebody who had been on a 5-day coke binge and came back and said, I was completely out of control. I had no way to do anything differently. And then she said, well, let's look at what you did. You had a whole method for how you were going to stop that binge. You were going to go to Burger King and you're going to get a fish sandwich. And you had a whole way of getting drugs where you made sure that you weren't in the same neighborhood as your family. So there were a lot of places where you showed control. And so that was an opportunity to show someone, I hear your experience, I recognize it, and there's a different interpretation of it. So that's one of the things that we do in harm reduction, is help people see, especially those of us in the helping professions, that we've been doing harm reduction all along. And then that third area where there's a challenge, and I've been talking a lot, so I have to do this, is challenge to skill. So you might have someone who says, you know, I think you have a good point, but I have no idea how to do what it is that you're talking about. And they may be a clinician, for example, that has used disapproval as a motivator and just don't know what to do else. And that's another area where there's a real challenge, and that's why we get very specific about the tips and the tricks that we use. We are very specific about things we say so that people can pick up on that and say, oh, I might say that too, I might try that too. So the next time I'm with a client, I might ask them, oh, well, how did you said you were on a binge, so what did you do in order to stop? I might use that same trick. I might use some of the tricks that I hear here. So then the other area where people will push back and push back hard has to do with how adults learn. And all this comes from Malcolm Knowles, who was a researcher in the 1940s and talked about the difference between how adults and children learn. And what he really found was that children are more or less blank slates, or at least that's how they're perceived, but adults are emphatically not. And they need to review every new piece of information they get, and they need to check it against what they already know. They need to check it against what they've already experienced, and they need to check it against what they believe. And so that's what people are doing when they're objecting, is they are trying to learn what it is that you know. Can I trust you? Tell me your information. What are your sources? They're trying to figure out whether or not you are trustworthy in terms of experience, in terms of skill, and in terms of knowledge. And so the reason they're doing it is they're considering changing. They're thinking about, well, maybe I do want to believe like this, maybe I do want to act like this, maybe I do want to change my practice. And so that's why we always really encourage objections, especially if you're giving a presentation of any kind. Really get to that part where people say, well, what about this? And let that happen. So what we're going to do next is go over these objections, and what I'm going to ask you to do in your group is to sit with what some of them are, pick one, Oh, I'm going to do this first. First, I'm going to explain. Yeah, all right. What am I doing? Okay, so I'm going to ask you to choose 1 or 2 objections, and then think about what's going on with that person. Why are they objecting in this way? Are they emotionally engaged in some negative fantasy about what might happen with their children, and why? Then think about what's some way that you could respond in a supportive and validating way, and is there any information that you could give them that might change things for them? And then, can you bring me back one previous, oh wait, here I can do this. Sorry. Slides are not in the correct order. And then this is the formula I'd like to propose for you when you think about how to respond to objections. Is that the very first thing we do is we validate what is it that this person has said. And it can be really simple. It can just be, thanks for bringing that up, that's a good point, that's an important point. That's something that comes up a lot in these conversations, so I'm glad you raised it. And the important thing there is to really be as sincere as possible. Is that when we say, I'm really glad you raised that, and they can tell that you're not really glad, that is really difficult. And then the next piece is just see if there's some information that might change things. A lot of times, if people have a little bit more information about who drug users are and why they use drugs, they might feel a little bit differently about what's happening. But there's many other studies, pieces of information about syringe exchange, about naloxone, about medication-assisted treatment. That's where you're bringing in the research that you've done and the facts that you know, that a lot of other people just don't know. And then the next part is, if you're in a group, open it up to the group. If you're doing a group presentation, ask what else do people think? Because one of the main ways that people learn is from each other. Is if the physician sitting right next to me is now convinced, that's going to convince me. So the more you can have the group having that conversation without you, the more successful you'll be in these kinds of community organizing things that we've been hearing about today. And then there's a time to move on. There's a certain point at which you can't make any progress with somebody, and you might need to just say, well, we don't agree about that, but I think what we can agree is that we all really want a healthy community. So let's talk about, and then you actually switch the subject. So those are the tips. So let me go back to this slide and ask you to get into groups and have these conversations. And what we will do, I have a little team, what we will do is we will come around and pretend, I'll give you 10 minutes, but in about 10 minutes we'll come around and pretend to be that person. So you can practice. You can just be yourselves. It's not a role play on your part, but we will provide you with somebody to practice with. Okay, clear? All right, go ahead. So I want to hear how that went. What were the things that you chose to talk about? How difficult was it when you came upon an angry Christian woman who wanted to discuss these ideas with you, or whoever your character showed up at your group? So what came up for you guys? Panic. Panic? Okay, thank you. Enabling. The enabling question came up. What else? Defensiveness. Yeah. What else?
The number of needles found in the community just thrown on the ground that we were providing.
Yeah. So when you tried to answer these objections, how did that go?
We nailed it according to James.
Okay. Oh, awesome. You nailed it. Fantastic.
Ridiculously valuable.
Well, yeah. Well, let me make that question a little bit more narrow. Go ahead.
I think it was helpful to find common ground with the person who was objecting. So, like, with the numbers, what is behind the question? Because at least in our case, like, you can find there was a good intention. There was a care for people, and like a desire for people to be sober and be able to, participate in society was kind of how we saw it.
Yeah, finding that common ground. And an old salesperson's trick is to pick up on a word that they just used. So if they start talking about their recovery, you start talking about recovery. If you can talk about your own, that might be appropriate. If not, talk about recovery in general. If they talk about the children, you start talking about the children. Echo what the words that they have just used, try to work those into the answer that you're bringing to them. What else? What other techniques did you use? Yeah. Validating? Yeah. And that is always my go-to lesson, is that I have watched this happen many, many times, and I have also done it myself, is forgotten to validate. And I've seen things go south really quickly because I feel cornered or defensive, and I start woman-splaining or harm reduction-splaining to the person that I'm talking to, and they tune out. They either tune out really quick or they get louder. So if I can remember that the first thing I do is say, oh, that's an important point, thank you. And one of the, sometimes people will say there's some things that you simply can't validate, and I don't agree. I think there's always something that we can find to acknowledge that it's another human being that just asked us this question, and to pay respect to the fact that this person is communicating with us. But it is true that some things are more difficult to validate than others, where you have to really search for a moment. And one of the great reasons to always start with a validation is it gives you time to think. So I had a workshop once where someone said, the only way that someone will ever experience recovery is if they accept our Lord Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. And so then I had to come up with a way of validating that, and a way of answering that, and a way of working with a group of people who didn't all have that same belief. So, being able to say something like, I think that one of the most transformative things that can happen in a person's life is to find faith. And people can find faith in Christianity, they can find faith in nature, they can find faith in other human beings, and it is absolutely transformative to believe something strongly and to have that belief powered by love. So anyway, that's what I came up with at the time, and it worked, but it was just giving me time to sort of think and, oh, what am I gonna say? So go with that validation when you can. Other techniques that people were using? Yeah?
Empathy, just human empathy for what you're hearing them say.
Yeah, absolutely. People want to, especially if they've brought that up in a town hall type meeting, they have been brave in order to say that. So they need a little extra support for having said that. And so empathizing is one of our key tools. What about the people who are doing the roving coaching? What did you see? Rachel?
One thing that I noticed was definitely the validation thing. Like, if I didn't hear it, it made me mad. Even though you told me to do that, but it did actually make me mad.
I had it too. I would also get mad.
It did actually make, but one thing that I found worked, one thing that I noticed is that if the transition from the validation to the information was prefaced by a but, then it made me mad. And if it was prefaced by an and, then I felt more open to the information. So,
are people familiar with the concept of yes and?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. What else? Other rovers? Yeah, Tycho.
One thing that I found that I really appreciated about one of the groups that I worked with was when they asked me open-ended questions. Like, I felt like they were interested in hearing more about something that I had said, and I unloaded a whole bunch of opinions and thoughts and of authority over my information, whether it was my own experience or my credentials or whatever. And I really appreciated hearing people kind of like, instead of
questions are also super helpful for biding time. That while you're thinking, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to say, you can say, oh, can you tell me more about what you've seen? Person, please be long-winded, so that you can come up with that. James?
Right here.
Yeah.
I thought that, I mean, similar to Tycho, just asking me to like define what I was talking about. I asked the good old-fashioned, like, isn't that just enabling? And like, well, what do you mean by enabling? Then it also gave me time, you know, as the person that was angry, to like kind of talk through what I was actually feeling, and then they're able to pinpoint, well, like what I was really getting at.
Mm-hmm. Did anybody working with enabling question decide, I had one group that did this, decide to say, oh yeah, I can see that. I think we are enabling in some ways, or to agree with what the person was saying, even if it's negative. Did anybody else make that choice? I don't know if you guys made that choice or I just thought you did. Yeah, because that's another option, is that when people accuse you of horrible things, is to say, oh yeah, we phrase it somewhat differently, but yeah, we are actually working with people while they continue to use drugs, and our expectation is that they will continue for the foreseeable future. Yeah, that is true. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Matt, did you see anything as coaching?
Hit on the big stuff.
Okay. Yeah, so I was really impressed. I thought people were coming at this with a lot of different techniques and real compassion for the person asking the question. I can say that sometimes when I do this workshop, people just shout me down. They just lose it, especially if I'm particularly obnoxious. And I did not have that experience, and so that's real congratulations to you on that. I think what happens is that as you do this more and more, you develop your own tricks. You develop things that work for you. And like one of my old standbys is that if you're a smoker and every time I walk past you outside my building, I say, you know, that's really bad for you. You don't avoid smoking, you avoid me. And that helps people understand what it means to engage with people and what non-judgmental provision of services looks like. And it's just, and other people have different metaphors that they use, and some work on some people. Like the motorcycle helmet one doesn't really work on me, but it works for other people. So thinking about, as you're developing your own harm reduction programs, what works on you? And what have you seen work on others? When do you see other people have that aha moment? The other thing that I use a lot is I'll draw a little triangle on a whiteboard and say, you know, 10% of people who inject drugs at any given time are in some kind of substance use treatment program. And then another 20% would like to be, or they're on a waiting list, or they've expressed interest. And so then there are 70% of people who are not in any kind of drug treatment program or not waiting for any kind of drug treatment program. And so those are the folks that I work with. And I think it's great, and I often do this with drug treatment professionals, I think it's great if you want to work with the 10%, that's fantastic, we need that. And I'm gonna work with this 90 here. And then people will be like, oh, okay, well, are we dividing it up fairly? That does not say. And so sometimes they will, you know, give it some thought of, yeah, of like, okay. So, you know, talking about harm reduction as being pragmatic and giving some concrete examples for why it is sometimes helpful. So I'm going to thank you all and pass it back over to James for closing out today.
Plumas County Public Health Agency, growing healthy communities.